That night, the rumors moved faster than armies. In the early hours, messages began to circulate across Caracas and far beyond it. Not official statements, not confirmations, just fragments, screenshots, whispers, claims that something extraordinary had happened, that the man who had ruled Venezuela for more than a decade was no longer where he was supposed to be. The palace was silent. State television said nothing. And silence, in moments like this, speaks louder than any announcement. For years, Nicolás Maduro had survived what many believed was impossible. Sanctions, international isolation, internal unrest, failed plots, diplomatic pressure. Each time the state remained intact. Power held, the system adapted. But power is not only about survival, it is about certainty. And on this night, certainty vanished. Reports claimed that an American operation had crossed a line that had never been crossed before, that this time pressure had become action, that the rules had changed. Whether true or not, the effect was immediate. Markets reacted, officials went quiet, allies hesitated, because in politics, belief can matter as much as reality. This was not yet a fall. It was the moment the ground stopped feeling solid. Part 2. As the hours passed, the absence became the story. No appearance, no denial, no confirmation. And in that vacuum, the idea of control began to collapse. Even if no capture had occurred, the perception alone reshaped the balance of power. Governments do not run on facts alone. They run on confidence, inside the system and outside it. And that confidence was draining by the minute. For years, Maduro's strength had been based on endurance. He did not need international approval. He needed internal cohesion, the loyalty of key institutions, the belief that no matter what happened, the center would hold. That belief fractured. Officials began to act defensively. Statements became cautious. Decisions were delayed. Their state still functioned, but it no longer moved with conviction. This is how power weakens in the modern world, not with tanks in the streets, but with hesitation in offices. The possibility, even unconfirmed, that a sitting leader could be removed by foreign force introduced a new reality, one where sovereignty felt conditional, where survival depended not on strength, but on restraint. And restraint is not a position of power. Whether the operation was real or exaggerated no longer mattered. The psychological threshold had been crossed. The idea that Maduro was untouchable no longer held. That night marked the end of inevitability. Part 3. By morning, the story had spread far beyond Venezuela. Debates erupted. Denials followed. Clarifications came too late. The damage was already done, not to a man, but to an image. Power, once questioned, never fully recovers. This was not the night Venezuela changed governments. It was the night Venezuela entered uncertainty. The alleged operation, real or not, exposed something deeper, how narrow the space for maneuver had become, how few options remained, how survival itself had turned into a defensive act. Empires fall in silence, governments weaken in doubt, and leaders lose power not only when they are removed, but when the world begins to imagine them gone. That was the true final night, not a confirmed capture, not a dramatic overthrow, but the moment when control no longer felt permanent and the future stopped being predictable. As the night stretched on, the absence became impossible to ignore. Not an announcement, not a confirmation, just the growing realization that something expected was no longer happening. In political systems built on control, silence is never neutral. It is either strength or fracture. And this silence felt different. It did not project authority. It projected uncertainty. For years, Venezuela's system had survived by normalizing crisis. Sanctions were absorbed. Shortages became routine. Isolation hardened into a kind of defensive identity. The state did not promise improvement. It promised continuity. And continuity, for a long time, was enough. But continuity depends on one fragile condition: the belief that tomorrow will still resemble today. That belief cracked during this night. As rumors spread, the question inside institutions was not, is it true, but what if it is? Because power does not wait for confirmation to reorganize itself. It reacts to risk. And the risk, for the first time in years, felt external, immediate, and uncontrollable. This is the moment when systems begin to change their behavior. Phones were answered more cautiously, statements were delayed, rewritten, softened, orders were issued, but followed by hesitation, not resistance, not rebellion, hesitation. And hesitation is fatal to centralized power. For a system that had survived by projecting inevitability, the mere possibility that its center could be physically removed introduced a new and destabilizing logic, one where sovereignty felt conditional, where endurance no longer guaranteed survival, where the line between pressure and action appeared thinner than ever before. The strength of Nicolás Maduro's position had never come from popularity. It came from predictability, from the understanding that, regardless of pressure, the structure would not collapse suddenly. That assumption was the real target of this night, and it was shaken. Inside the government, officials began to think defensively rather than strategically. When systems are confident, they plan forward. When they feel exposed, they conserve. Decisions narrowed, initiatives stalled. The state still moved, but without momentum. This is how power loses altitude, not through dramatic events, but through a slow recalibration of expectations. When everyone starts acting as if the future is smaller than it was yesterday. Outside the country, the reaction was equally revealing. Allies did not rush to deny. Rivals did not rush to confirm. Diplomacy slowed into careful language. Analysts shifted tone. The question was no longer whether the leadership was stable, but how fragile that stability had become. That shift alone reshaped reality. Because in geopolitics, perception is not commentary, it is force. The possibility that a sitting leader could be removed through external action, even if unproven, changed the cost-benefit calculations of everyone involved. Military loyalty is not tested by ideology alone, but by the perceived durability of command. Economic actors respond not to ideology, but to risk. Political elites measure not morality, but probability. And probability was moving. This was not panic. Panic is loud. This was quieter and therefore more dangerous. A collective pause, a subtle pulling back, a moment where everyone waited for someone else to speak first. Waiting is the enemy of authority. The longer the silence lasted, the more it redefined the limits of power. The state still existed. The institutions still functioned. But they were no longer projecting certainty outward. They were absorbing uncertainty inward. This is the point where survival stops being proactive. For years, the leadership had framed endurance as victory. Survive this crisis, then the next. Absorb pressure, outlast opponents. But endurance works only when the horizon remains open, when time feels like an ally. On this night, time felt different. It felt compressed. Every hour without clarity reduced the number of acceptable outcomes. Every unanswered question expanded the space for interpretation. And interpretation, in moments like this, becomes reality faster than facts. The system had not collapsed, but it had lost initiative. And once initiative is lost, power becomes reactive. Instead of shaping events, it responds to them. Instead of defining the narrative, it chases it. This is the threshold that separates dominance from defense. Even if nothing had happened physically, something had shifted psychologically. The idea that control was absolute had been replaced by the suspicion that it was conditional. That survival depended not only on internal cohesion, but on external restraint. That realization alone marked a turning point, because leaders can survive opposition, they can survive sanctions, they can survive isolation. What they cannot survive is the moment when the world begins to imagine them gone and adjusts accordingly. This night did not end a government, it narrowed its future, and once a future narrows, every step forward feels heavier than the last. By the time morning approached, the damage was already done, not to buildings, not to institutions, but to the most fragile element of power, its image of permanence. History often teaches that governments fall when they lose control. In reality, they begin to fall when they lose inevitability. When the idea that this will continue is replaced by the quieter, more dangerous thought, this might not. That shift happened during this night. Even as denials emerged, even as officials attempted to restore calm, the system could not return to its previous state. Because certainty, once cracked, does not heal the way structures do. You can repair infrastructure, you can replace personnel, but belief does not reset. The leadership still functioned, the state still governed, orders were still followed, but something essential had slipped. For years, survival had been framed as proof of strength. Each crisis endured was presented as evidence that the system was unbreakable. But this night reframed endurance itself. It suggested that survival might no longer be a choice, but a condition imposed by external tolerance. That distinction matters. A system that survives because it cannot be removed is powerful. A system that survives because it has not yet been removed is fragile. This was the line crossed. From this point forward, every calculation changed. Allies reassessed how closely they should stand. Internal actors recalculated how much risk loyalty required. External powers adjusted their language, their timing, their expectations. None of this required confirmation. Power does not dissolve when a leader is taken. It dissolves when everyone begins to plan for that possibility. That is what made this night irreversible. Even if no physical removal had occurred, the psychological removal had already begun. The image of invulnerability had been replaced by a conditional one. And conditional power is no longer sovereign power. The leadership could continue governing, but it could not return to the illusion that time was on its side. Every future decision would now be made under a new constraint, the awareness that the margin for error had vanished. That restraint, not resistance, defined the new reality. This is how final nights truly function. They are not about endings. They are about narrowing. The future does not disappear. It collapses inward. Options close. Risks multiply. Every move becomes heavier because every move now carries history with it. This night did not decide Venezuela's outcome. It decided that outcomes would now be decided faster than before. It also revealed something deeper about modern power. In an interconnected world, sovereignty is not only defended by borders and armies, it is defended by perception, expectation, and restraint. When any of those weaken, the system becomes exposed in ways force alone cannot fix. That exposure lingered. In the days that followed, life continued. Markets opened, statements were issued, normality attempted to reassert itself. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted. The future no longer felt expandable. It felt managed. And managed futures are not symbols of strength. They are signs of survival mode. This is why the night matters even without a confirmed event. Because history is not shaped only by what happens, but by what becomes believable. The idea that a sitting leader could be removed by external force crossed from fantasy into plausibility. And plausibility is enough to alter behavior at every level. This is the moment where power stops projecting outward and begins folding inward, where authority becomes defensive, where endurance stops being victory and becomes delay. That transformation does not reverse. You cannot convince the world to forget that it imagined your absence. You cannot unteach institutions that they once prepared for your removal. This was not the fall of a government. It was the end of a phase. The phase where control equaled confidence. The phase where time felt infinite. The phase where survival itself was enough. After this night, survival would demand something more. And that is why it belongs here. Not because a leader fell, not because an operation succeeded or failed, but because this was the night power learned its limits and could not unlearn them. That is what defines a final night, not the collapse itself, but the moment after which nothing feels guaranteed again.